origins of a killer. On Christmas Eve in 1969, in the town of Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, a boy named Stephen Griffiths was born. He was the eldest of 3 children, arriving into what seemed, on the surface, to be an ordinary British family. His father worked as a frozen food salesman, a stable job that kept the household financially afloat. His mother managed the home and raised the children. To neighbors, they looked like any other family in the area, unremarkable, steady, and entirely normal. But beneath the surface of this ordinary setting, fractures were forming. When Stephen was still young, his parents' marriage began to unravel. By the time he entered his teenage years, the split was complete. His father moved out, and Stephen remained in the household with his mother. Divorce was difficult enough for any child, but for Stephen, it created a well of resentment that never closed. He seemed to blame his mother for the disintegration of the marriage, developing what psychologists later described as utter contempt for her. Local rumors about her behavior, including whispers that she entertained men in ways that humiliated her son, only fed into Stephen's growing bitterness. It was a toxic dynamic. The boy's relationship with his mother, the first woman he ever knew, set a foundation of mistrust and disdain toward women that would one day escalate into violence. Psychologists later theorized that his contempt for her became generalized, transposed onto women in general. To Stephen, women were not partners or equals but targets, symbols of betrayal, and sources of rage. An education bought but wasted in 1982, his father tried to intervene. Wanting to provide stability and opportunity, he scraped together enough money to send 13-year-old Stephen to a prestigious public school, costing the 9,000 a year. It was a chance for the boy to rise above his circumstances, to find structure and achievement in education. But Stephen squandered it. Instead of thriving, he displayed an arrogant aloofness. Teachers and classmates alike described him as someone who believed he knew better than everyone else. He resisted instruction, dismissing authority with disdain. That intellectual arrogance meant he underachieved, refusing to engage with the lessons or put effort into his studies. By the time he should have been preparing for A-levels, he had derailed his own education. Ironically, the school had an infamous former pupil whose story fascinated the young Griffiths, John George Hay, the acid bath murderer. Hay's crimes of dissolving his victims in acid to cover up their murders had shocked Britain in the mid-20th century. For Stephen, discovering that such a notorious killer had walked the same halls was not a deterrent, it was inspiration. This macabre connection lodged in his imagination, fueling the beginnings of a fascination with violent crime that would grow into obsession. The knife and the briefcase. By his teenage years, Stephen was no longer simply an arrogant student. He had become a loner, isolating himself from peers, cultivating an image that was both eccentric and threatening. He often carried a briefcase filled with knives and weapons, openly showing his fascination with violence. He devoured martial arts magazines, pored over articles about weapons, and began to speak with a casual interest in murder and brutality. It was at this stage that psychologists would later identify the first real warning signs. Many killers have childhoods filled with cruelty to animals, fire-setting, or petty crime. In Griffith's case, the signs came later, in adolescence. His obsessions emerged suddenly and fully formed, blending with criminal behavior in a way that should have raised alarms. The shoplifting incident, the real escalation, came in 1986, when Stephen was 17. He was caught shoplifting at a local supermarket, a crime that might otherwise have earned him a warning or community service. But when confronted by the shopkeeper, Stephen pulled out a knife. Without hesitation, he slashed the man so badly that the wound required 186 stitches. This was not a frightened teenager lashing out in panic. This was a young man already comfortable with the use of extreme violence. The attack shocked the community. Here was a boy from a respectable background, attending a good school, who had transformed into a knife-wielding attacker with barely a second thought. In court, he was sentenced to 3 years behind bars, a prison term that introduced him fully to the criminal justice system. During his probation and psychological evaluations, Stephen made a chilling admission. He fantasized about becoming a serial killer. He said it openly, without shame, almost daring officials to take him seriously. But they didn't. His confession was dismissed as bravado, the dark humor of a troubled young man who wanted attention. Authorities missed the opportunity to intervene meaningfully, and Stephen walked out of prison with his fantasies intact, perhaps even emboldened. prison and early fantasies, prison did not reform him. Instead, it sharpened his identity. He emerged more convinced than ever that he was different from others, that he was destined for a darker path. He had experienced the rush of using violence, the thrill of wielding power over another human being. It would not be the last time. After his release, he attempted to put his life on a more conventional track. He enrolled in college to finish his A levels and was eventually accepted into Leeds University, where he studied psychology. On paper, this looked like redemption. In reality, it was the opposite. Psychology gave Stephen the academic tools to study, not just human behavior, but specifically the minds of killers. He absorbed the theories of criminology, learned about abnormal psychology, and quietly nourished his fascination with serial murder. The Gothic persona. During this time, Stephen began cultivating a persona that made him stand out. He embraced the goth subculture, dressing in black leather, slicking his hair back, and leaning into an image of menace. He collected reptiles and would even walk lizards on leashes in public, further cementing his reputation as a local oddball. Yet, despite his theatrics, no one took him seriously. Friends and neighbors dismissed him as eccentric but harmless, an awkward loner who wanted attention. For Stephen, this dismissal was humiliating. He craved recognition, respect, even fear. Being seen as a loser only fueled his desire to prove himself in a way that would force the world to take notice. Violence against women. By the early 1990s, Griffiths' obsession with weapons had not waned. In 1992, when a girl laughed at him, he responded by holding a knife to her throat. For this, he was given a 2-year prison sentence. This time, psychiatrists evaluated him more closely. He was briefly held under the Mental Health Act and analyzed at Rampton Secure Hospital, where Britain's most disturbed offenders are treated. Doctors gave him varying diagnoses. Some described him as having a severe personality disorder. Others labeled him a schizoid psychopath. Importantly, none of them deemed him mentally ill in the way that could be treated. He was classified as untreatable and released back into society. Once again, the system had seen the danger, but shrugged responsibility. The warning signs ignored. Looking back, the warning signs of Stephen Griffiths' trajectory are painfully clear. A broken home and deep resentment toward his mother. An arrogant, aloof student who rejected authority and scorned others. An adolescent fascination with knives and weapons, carried everywhere he went. A violent attack at 17 that nearly killed a shopkeeper. Open confessions of wanting to be a serial killer. A second prison sentence for threatening a woman with a knife. Psychiatric evaluations labeling him dangerous but untreatable. Each of these moments represented an opportunity for intervention, but each time, society failed to act decisively. Instead, Stephen slipped through the cracks, carrying his obsessions with him. A growing identity. By the mid-1990s, Griffiths had transformed himself into something more than just a troubled young man. He was building a persona, a character he would inhabit with increasing commitment. Online, he began calling himself Venpariah, a name that conjured images of a vengeful outcast. It was a mask, but one that revealed his true self more than it concealed it. This identity gave him power, a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise rejected him. Through Venpariah, he could be feared, respected, and recognized. In his mind, Stephen Griffiths, the awkward loner, no longer mattered. What mattered was the birth of the monster he believed he was destined to become. And as the 1990s drew to a close, the groundwork was set. He had the obsessions, the fantasies, the tools, and the arrogance. What remained was the final step to turn thought into action, fantasy into reality. And when that moment came, the world would remember his name. Becoming Venpariah by the mid-1990s, Stephen Griffiths had already shown the world who he really was. He had attacked with knives, admitted fantasies of becoming a serial killer, and collected psychiatric labels that marked him as dangerous but untreatable. Yet, despite the red flags, he remained free, living in West Yorkshire, quietly growing into the role he had always envisioned for himself, not just a loner obsessed with violence, but a killer in waiting. What separated Griffiths from many other violent offenders was the way he crafted his persona. He didn't stumble blindly into murder. He prepared for it like a project, building an identity around the idea of killing. The persona he created, Venpariah, was a grotesque alter ego that he cultivated online and in his daily life. Through Venpariah, Griffiths could reinvent himself as something bigger than the awkward boy who had been dismissed as a loser. Venpariah was meant to be feared, respected, and ultimately remembered. A Gothic transformation. After his release from prison in the early 1990s, Griffiths leaned heavily into an alternative Gothic identity. He dressed in black leather, slicked back his hair, and surrounded himself with objects that gave off an aura of menace. Neighbors recalled him walking his pet lizards on leashes, a bizarre sight that became part of his eccentric reputation. Far from blending in, Griffiths wanted to be noticed. His outward appearance was designed to shock and repel, but his efforts to appear menacing often had the opposite effect. People dismissed him as a creepy oddball, a man desperate for attention rather than a figure to be taken seriously. This humiliation cut deeply. To Griffiths, being mocked or ignored only reinforced the narrative that he was an outcast. He didn't just want to be seen as strange, he wanted to be feared. This rejection hardened his determination. If society would not recognize him on his terms, then he would force recognition through notoriety. He would become the killer he had so often spoken about, a man whose name would be uttered with the same dread reserved for his idols. Academic obsession with murder. Ironically, Griffiths' path to murder was paved not only by his obsessions, but also by academia. Despite his chaotic life, he remained intelligent and articulate. He earned a degree in psychology from Leeds University, graduating with a first-class mark. But rather than using this education for rehabilitation or a legitimate career, Griffiths used it to study the minds of killers he idolized. By the early 2000s, he had taken his obsession further by enrolling in a PhD program at the University of Bradford. His chosen field of study, Victorian serial killers. To his professors and peers, it was framed as a historical analysis, an academic exercise in criminology. But for Griffiths, it was something much darker. He wasn't studying serial killers out of curiosity or academic rigor. He was studying them to learn, to compare their methods, to see what made them effective, and to decide how he might one day join their ranks. He called himself a doctor of serial killing, openly admitting that he wasn't just fascinated by the killers of the past. He wanted to become one of them in the present. This obsession dovetailed with his idolization of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who had terrorized West Yorkshire in the 1970s by murdering 13 women, many of them sex workers. Griffiths moved deliberately into Bradford's red light district, placing himself in the same hunting ground as Sutcliffe. This was not coincidence. It was a calculated move, a way of embedding himself in the geography of his hero, rehearsing in the same streets, breathing the same air, and preparing to repeat history. The collapse of normal relationships, even as he cultivated Ven Pariah and pursued his twisted academic path. Griffiths occasionally tried to maintain relationships with women, but these efforts inevitably fell apart. His compulsions, obsessions, and menacing lifestyle made intimacy impossible. One girlfriend entered his flat and was horrified by what she saw: crossbows, weapons, stacks of books on serial killing, and plastic sheeting covering the floor. The scene resembled a kill room rather than a home. She left immediately and never returned. For Griffiths, this rejection was not surprising. By then, he had already accepted that normal life was beyond him. His ego, fragile and brittle, could not withstand repeated failure with women. Instead, he turned fully toward the one identity that never rejected him: Ven Pariah. With his family estranged, his social life in ruins, and his relationships collapsing, Griffiths sank deeper into isolation. He lived alone in his Bradford flat, his only companions the reptiles he kept as pets and the dark fantasies that consumed his mind. Ven Pariah, the monster within. On the internet, Griffiths allowed Ven Pariah to flourish. He created online profiles that projected an image of menace and strength, a persona built around death, violence, and power. The name itself was symbolic. Ven evoked venom, poison, danger. Pariah marked him as an outcast, rejected by society but powerful in his rejection. Through Ven Pariah, Griffiths could be the man he could never be in real life: feared, admired, dangerous. He consumed violent pornography, obsessed over the mechanics of killing, and immersed himself in the online world of dark fantasy. To outsiders, Ven Pariah might have seemed like just another internet persona, a performance of Gothic theatrics. But to Griffiths, Ven Pariah was not a mask, it was the truth. He saw Ven Pariah as his destiny, the identity he was meant to inhabit fully. Stephen Griffiths, the man, was a failure, mocked, rejected, dismissed. But Ven Pariah would succeed. Ven Pariah would kill. The warning signs intensified. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Griffiths was spiraling deeper. His criminal record grew with repeated convictions for carrying weapons in public, Each arrest underscored his obsession with knives, crossbows, and violence. Yet time and again, he was released. The system had no effective mechanism to contain him. In 1992, after threatening a girl with a knife, he had been sectioned under the Mental Health Act and evaluated by psychiatrists. Their assessments varied, labeling him everything from severely disordered to schizoid psychopath. The conclusion, however, was always the same: he was untreatable. He was released back into the world, more embittered than before. By 2008, Griffiths' neighbors had begun reporting him to authorities. His behavior disturbed them. His appearance was menacing, his hours erratic, and his presence unsettling. The building's managers even installed CCTV cameras to monitor him. He was effectively living under surveillance, and yet he still managed to carry out his crimes. The cameras did not deter him. If anything, they gave him an audience. The declaration of becoming shortly before his first known murder. Griffiths posted a message on MySpace, echoing a line from Thomas Harris' Red Dragon, the novel that introduced the world to the fictional serial killer Francis Dolarhyde. The line was about becoming, the transformation from ordinary man into something monstrous, transcendent, feared. For Griffiths, this was not fiction. It was prophecy. Everything in his life, the knives, the prison confessions, the gothic persona, the PhD in serial killing, the Ven Paria identity, had been leading to this moment. He was no longer content to fantasize. He wanted to act. He wanted to kill. The perfect hunting ground, Bradford's red light district, was the ideal stage for Griffiths' debut as a killer. Like Sutcliffe before him, Griffiths understood that sex workers were among the most vulnerable targets. They lived transient lives, often estranged from family, frequently moving between cities. Their disappearances were less likely to be reported quickly, their absence less likely to spark an immediate investigation. To a predator like Griffiths, this vulnerability was not tragedy, it was opportunity. Sex workers could be lured with little resistance, taken without witnesses, and killed without immediate consequence. He had studied this through Sutcliffe's history, through criminology, and through his own twisted analysis. Now, he was ready to apply it. From theory to practice, by 2009, Griffiths' transformation was complete. Stephen Griffiths, the awkward, alienated boy from Dewsbury, was gone. In his place stood Ven Paria, the Crossbow Cannibal, a man who had dedicated his life to preparing for the moment when he would kill. He was armed with knowledge, years of studying killers academically, psychologically, and practically. He was armed with weapons, knives, crossbows, and the confidence of someone who had used them before. He was armed with arrogance, the belief that he was smarter than the police, more cunning than his victims, destined to be remembered. The only step left was to act, and in June 2009, he did. By the summer of 2009, Stephen Griffiths had spent nearly 4 decades preparing for the role he believed destiny had written for him. The loner from Dewsbury had cultivated an alter ego. Ven Paria, obsessed over the Yorkshire Ripper, earned a degree studying killers, and collected an arsenal of weapons in his Bradford flat. His failures in ordinary life no longer mattered. In his mind, he had one final step to take to kill, and on June 22, 2009, he crossed the line from fantasy into reality. The first victim, Susan Rushworth, that evening 43-year-old Susan Rushworth, a mother of 3 and known sex worker, stepped off a bus near Bradford's red light district. She was vulnerable, battling addiction, estranged from much of her family, moving through a world where danger lurked at every corner. For Griffiths, she was the perfect target. He lured her back to his flat, an apartment already set up for the violence he had rehearsed for years. The details of what happened inside remain speculative, because Susan's body was never recovered. But investigators believe Griffiths killed her with his signature weapon, a crossbow. Before dismembering her in the bathtub, the cold efficiency of the killing suggested this was not an impulsive act. It was planned, rehearsed, and executed with precision. Afterward, he disposed of her remains in the River Aire, carrying body parts on public transport to dump them in the water. It was a shocking level of arrogance. Most killers take steps to conceal their actions, but Griffiths flaunted his. He paraded bags of body parts on buses, confident no one would suspect him. He had crossed the threshold into murder, and he had gotten away with it. Susan vanished without a trace. With no body and few clues, her disappearance faded quickly from headlines. To her family, the absence was devastating. To Griffiths, it was validation. His plan had worked. He had killed, and the world had not caught him. The second victim, Shelley Armitage, less than a year later, on April 26, 2010, Griffiths struck again. His target was 31-year-old Shelley Armitage, another mother, another sex worker, another woman trapped in a cycle of addiction and vulnerability. Like Susan, she was lured back to his flat, killed with a crossbow, and dismembered. But this murder revealed something new about Griffiths, his hunger for recognition. He didn't just kill Shelley. He filmed her death on his mobile phone, narrating the horrific act as if creating a grotesque home movie. The footage was graphic, pornographic in its violence, a twisted trophy for him to revisit. Shockingly, Griffiths later lost the phone on a train. The footage was seen by members of the public, some of whom even tried to sell it as pornography, before eventually handing it to authorities. That such evidence could circulate without immediately leading to his arrest was astonishing. Once again, Griffiths slipped through the cracks. For him, the near miss only fed his arrogance. He had killed twice, disposed of bodies in plain sight, and filmed his crimes. And still he was free. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, destined to become the infamous figure he longed to be. The third victim, Suzanne Myers, on May 22, 2010, Griffiths killed for the third time. His victim was 36-year-old Suzanne Myers, another woman from Bradford's red light district. Like the others, she was vulnerable, struggling, and easy prey for a predator like him. But unlike the previous murders, this killing was different. Griffiths' arrogance had reached such heights that he no longer cared about secrecy. In fact, he performed the murder knowing full well he was being watched. CCTV cameras had been installed in his apartment block in 2008 because of complaints about his behavior. On the day of Suzanne's murder, those cameras captured chilling footage. Suzanne was seen running for her life, trying desperately to escape Griffiths. He chased her down, dragged her back into his flat, and killed her with a crossbow. Then, in a moment that defined his descent into infamy, Griffiths turned to the camera and made a defiant middle finger gesture. It was his declaration he didn't care who knew. He wanted to be seen. The footage was discovered days later by the building's caretaker, who had been reviewing the tapes. Horrified, he contacted the police, but only after first contacting a tabloid newspaper to sell his story. The fact that even in this moment, profit was prioritized over immediate justice was another dark reflection of the society Griffiths despised. But this time, there was no escape for him. The evidence was undeniable. The CCTV had captured the act, the arrogance, the killer in full view. Griffiths' fantasy of becoming was complete, but so too was his downfall. Arrest and confession. When police arrived at his flat, Griffiths did not resist. Unlike many killers who attempt to flee or deny their crimes, he simply waited. He had achieved what he wanted to kill, to be recognized, to be infamous. In his twisted logic, there was no need to run. During interrogation, he was disturbingly candid. When asked if he had killed Suzanne Myers, he said yes. When asked about Shelley Armitage, he said yes again. And when asked about Susan Rushworth, he confirmed it as well. He told investigators, "I don't have much time for the human race." His words dripped with contempt and arrogance. He presented himself as superior, indifferent, almost bored by the process of confession. He gave short answers, dismissive shrugs, and a chilling lack of remorse. When pressed on why he killed, his response was telling. "I don't know." Psychologists analyzing the interviews later suggested that his dismissive answers masked a deeper truth. He did know why. It was about power, recognition, and the fulfillment of his Venn paria persona. But admitting that would have meant acknowledging vulnerability, something his arrogance could never allow. The Crossbow Cannibal, at his first court appearance in May 2010, Griffiths stunned onlookers. When asked his name, he did not respond with Stephen Griffiths. Instead, he smirked and declared himself the Crossbow Cannibal. It was a self-glorifying title, designed to cement his place in what he imagined was a hall of fame of killers. The reference echoed Hannibal the Cannibal, the fictional character from Silence of the Lambs, blending reality with the pop culture he so adored. The name stuck in the media, just as he intended. There were even claims he had cannibalized parts of his victims. Whether true or not, the statement served its purpose to amplify his infamy, to present himself as more monstrous than even Peter Sutcliffe. He wanted to be remembered as Britain's next great killer. Not a failure, not a loser, but a legend of horror. trial and sentencing in December 2010, Griffiths pleaded guilty to the murders of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamires. His guilty pleas shocked many. Killers often deny responsibility or drag trials out, but Griffiths accepted his role without hesitation. Again, it was part of his arrogance. He wanted the world to know what he had done. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years, meaning he would not be eligible for parole until at least 2036. He was sent to Wakefield Prison, one of Britain's most notorious high-security facilities, where other infamous killers such as Harold Shipman and Robert Maudsley had been held. In sentencing, the judge described Griffiths as a dangerous, predatory individual who killed without mercy.